in anyway. Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to present Professor Robin Hanson, who has got a wonderfully mixed background in physics, artificial intelligence, sociology, and economics. He's professor at George Mason University and also associated with us at the Future Humanity Institute here in Oxford. And I've known him for, it's more than 20 years now. We have been interacting online, and I remember when I came on to that mailing list that you already were working on what would later be the first publication that are at the root of this line of inquiry that led to this book. So we've been kind of discussing and arguing about that also for more than 20 years now. So without further ado, I think you're going to have your minds blown and hopefully uploaded.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I'm going to talk for less than half the time. We're going to have lots of time for questions. I will take questions along the way, but I may say let's wait on that depending on what it is. So let's just get started. This is a big picture in the usual point of view. This is the US economy over the last 4 years. Every bar here that went up or down was big news because the economy was growing more or less or not growing. But we're going to look at a bigger picture. This is the world economy over the last half century or so. And now the y-axis is the log of the world economy. And as you may know, exponentials look like lines on log linear graphs, and that looks like a line, roughly. So that the major story is the world economy has been growing exponentially for a half century or so. This is over 2,000 years. Again, a y-axis that's log, but it no longer looks like a line. Why? The famous Industrial Revolution. Before, it looks like there was no growth, and then we figured out how to grow, and ever since then, we've been doubling the world economy every 15 years. In 150 years, that's 10 doublings, big deal. However, you go back even farther, 10,000 years, and you find it was growing exponentially before. It was just growing a lot slower, doubling roughly every 1,000 years. And before 5,000 BC or so, it looks like it wasn't growing before then, but if you look back even farther, it is plausibly growing exponentially even slower, doubling roughly every 250,000 years. We can go back farther and actually see that brains seem to have been growing roughly exponentially for 500 million years, and perhaps genomes growing exponentially for an even longer period. If you just look at the human history part of it, you'll see it actually fits pretty well as a sequence of exponential modes. That is steady exponential growth punctuated by relatively sharp transitions to faster growth modes, transitions usually taking less than a doubling time. We can even get estimates for these doubling times, how much the doubling times have doubled, how many doubles each era went through. But I want to let you think of it this way. Now on the x-axis, I've compressed it by having a log of time till sometime in the near future. And on the y-axis, I now have a growth rate. So you can see relatively steady growth rates punctuated by sharp transitions where the growth rate goes up by a factor of 50 or more to a faster growth rate, which then lasts through 7 to 15 doublings until within less than a previous doubling time, it grows to another faster growth rate. If this pattern were to continue, then what would happen is sometime roughly in the next century, not very precise, there would be a 5 or so year period during which the economy would go from doubling every 15 years to doubling every month, perhaps. And that would continue for a year or two, and then something else would happen. That would be the continuation of these trends. Now, that has to sound pretty crazy. But of course, all these previous transitions would have sounded crazy to people who hadn't seen them before either. What could possibly do this? There are many possible scenarios, but one of the most common speculations about what could cause an enormous increase in the growth rate of the economy and huge social change is robots as smart as people, artificial intelligence. There are many possible scenarios about how that could happen. One most conservative scenario is that we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 70 years, slowly accumulating better software of various sorts. I used to be an AI researcher for 9 years, and when I talk to AI researchers who have been in a field at least 20 years, how far have we come in those 20 years as a percentage of the distance to human level abilities in your subfield? And the usual answer I get is 5 to 10%, no noticeable acceleration. So At that rate, it would take 2 to 4 centuries to reach human-level abilities in the typical field, not much less most of them. That's not in your lifetime, perhaps, but it's shorter than the distance to the Roman Empire. It's something to think about. There are many people who expect faster progress. Even though progress has been slow in the past, they think in the next few decades we will have a huge burst of progress and we will reach this level sooner. That's one possibility. I'm going to talk in this talk and in my book, The Age of M, about one particular scenario that's different from these two scenarios, which is analogous to porting software. Today, if you have a computer, an old computer that's running software you like, and you'd like software like that to run on a new computer you have, one approach is, of course, to stare at the old software, try to guess how it works, try to write software in the new computer that acts like how you think the old software works, and if you eventually get it right, you'll now have software that runs on the new computer that works like the old software. That's one approach. It's hard. A different approach is to write what's called an emulator. This makes the new computer look like the old one to the software. If you can succeed in writing an emulator of the old computer on the new computer, you can just move the software over without understanding how it works, and it will just directly work on that new computer. So the idea here is to do that for the human brain, port the software in the human brain. So to do that, we'll need 3 things. 3 technologies will have to reach levels that none of them are near at the moment. So it's not right around the corner. First, we'll need lots of cheap, fast, parallel computers. There's a whole industry working on doing that, but they're still a long way off. Second, we need to take particular human brains and scan them in fine spatial and chemical detail to see which cells are of what type, where, connected to what. And third, we need to take individual cells and have models of how they work. So today, people work on having a particular kind of cell in the brain and modeling how it takes input signals, changes internal state, and sends output signals. And so we need models like that, which we have decent ones for some cells, for all the different kinds of cells in the brain. If you have good enough models for how each cell works, and you have a scan showing for a particular brain where the cells are, what type, etc., then you can make a model of an entire brain. And if you made a model of an entire brain and you had cheap enough computers, you could make a cheap model such that it would run as fast as a person but still be cheaper than a person. And if you can do that, everything changes. That's a brain emulation. Now, we don't know how much detail in brain cells matter. In most other cells in the body, like bone cells or muscle cells, most of the details don't matter. There's just a few key details that do matter. For brain cells, all we care about are the details that affect how they take signals and process them and change them. We don't know how far into the details of cells we're going to have to go to do that. If in pessimistic cases we have to go a long way into a lot of detail, it'll take a lot longer until computers are cheap enough to model that cheaply. So at Moore's law rate, it might take a century to get there. But roughly sometime in the next century, projection is it should be possible to make a brain emulation using ordinary computers. So that's faster than 2 to 4 centuries, which suggests weakly that this scenario might happen before the other kind of artificial intelligence matures, which is the premise of this book, which is why it's worth thinking about. Now, I've been around people for many decades who have been talking about this scenario of brain emulations. It used to be called uploads. And when people talk about it, they love to talk about the technology and how it works, or when it might happen. They ask philosophy questions like, if you made a machine, an emulation, would it be conscious or is it just a machine? If you made an emulation of me and it's over there on the other side of the room, is that me still or is that somebody else? These are all fascinating questions that I'm going to ignore. Because I think there's this neglected question, which doesn't come up much in all the years I've heard people speculate about this, which is what actually happens in the world? How does the world actually change if this technology is available? That's what I want to discuss. Now, on Amazon.com, if you look up the keyword history, you'll find about 20% of the books have the keyword history, and only 1% of the books have a keyword future. Vastly more interest in the past than the future, apparently. But if you look in fiction, you'll see more interest in future fiction than in past fiction. Why so much more interest in the past than the future when nonfiction? People usually say, well, the answer is obvious. We have artifacts about the past, so we can study the past. We have no artifacts about the future, therefore we can't study the future. But I think that's just wrong. We can study the future using theory. Now, here's 3 different ways to think about studying the future. One is to take current trends and project them forward, i.e. less religion, more democracy, more leisure, less marriage, whatever it is, and say, how does the world change with those trends? Another approach is to look at technologies or disruptors that might change the trends and move them somewhere else, and try to imagine those, like self-driving cars, blockchains. You can look into those technologies, ask when will they appear and what form. Or third kind of futurism, you could take one of those future disruption technologies and ask, what are the consequences? How does the social world change as a result of that? Now, most of the people who do number two have a training in some sort of physical or technical sciences, and like me when I was a physics undergraduate, they were basically taught there is no such thing as social science. It's bullshit. They just make it up over there. Stay here. You can trust us. And as I become an economic professor, I realized that's just wrong. There is a lot of social science, and it is possible actually to take standard social science and apply it to these disruptive scenarios to figure out what would actually happen. And I've written this book in part to try to show that. This is a map of academia, all the different major fields connected by co-citation links of who cites who. It's interesting that it's a ring. That's irrelevant for our purposes. For our purposes, what we care about is these are all the fields that I'm going to draw on for this book. It's an unusually wide range of areas that usually is penalized in academia. I'm trying to make a virtue out of it by doing a book you couldn't do without having a wide range of backgrounds. That allows me to take the strategy of picking the low-hanging fruit. I'm just going to go area by area through academic consensus, really, and ask what's the most straightforward implications of that field for this scenario. When it's easy, I draw a conclusion and I add it to the pile. When it's hard, I just skip it and go on to the next thing. This is an exercise in theory. We don't have data on the future, but we can apply all of our standard theories to it. As theorists do everywhere, I will look for my keys under the lamppost. That means I make simplifying assumptions as necessary to draw concrete conclusions. So I'm going to explain to you my simplifying assumptions. I'm going to use efficiency as a way of analyzing, which is how we often do it, even understanding our world or the past. If you looked at a subsistence farm from 1,000 years ago, you can just use the mere fact that they were trying to be efficient farmers to predict many things about that world and choose where they farm, what crops, what time of day, what time of year, etc. I'm going to use efficiency thinking about the future. This is my last slide before I start telling you about the age of M. As an academic covering my ass, I'm trying to tell you my methods and my assumptions, so this is the last slide about that. First of all, I'm trying not to be creative or original other than by asking this unusual question. I'm just going to apply standard, as best I can find it, academic consensus in each area and not be contrarian. I'm going to try to describe what this world would look like if we did the least to avoid it, the path of least resistance. It's not my job to make you love it or hate it, just to tell you how I see it. I will be happy if it sounds more like a history book or a business case book and less like a science fiction movie or comic book. That's what I'm looking for. I'm going to focus on the robots because that's where most of the action is. We'll talk some about the non-robot humans, but there will be less to say about them. Sorry. I'm going to not tell you about the next trillion years of the universe. Many people want a futurist talk to tell you about the entire history of the universe. My ambition is only to tell you about the next great era after ours that's as different from ours as ours was from the farming or foraging eras that came before us. It may only last a year or two, but that's still I want to tell you about. I'm going to tell you about this world once they get used to it. You are now in the industrial era. You're used to it. Your actions are in equilibrium roughly with knowing the world you live in. During, say, 1820, our world was not in equilibrium. There was a transition to industry. People didn't know where it was going, and it's harder to predict people in transition than in equilibrium. As an economist, I'm going to use our economist standard first cut tool for everything, which is called supply and demand. Supply and demand assumes that there are many buyers and sellers for whatever's being bought and sold, and there's relatively little regulation. People are free to choose their prices. I'm not saying there should not be regulation or will not be regulation. I'm saying this is our standard first cut reference point to figuring out other scenarios. Finally, I'm going to assume these emulations are simple and opaque, which makes more sense in the early era, less in the later era. So these emulations are black boxes. You made a scan of a brain, you made a model of it, there's the box. You can turn it on, turn it off, erase it, copy it, run it fast, run it slow, that's it. You can't take one person's music, another person's sport, combine them with the third person's Christmas vacation memory, and make a combination. You can't go in there and move things around. You don't understand it. It's a spaghetti code mess, but you can turn it on and run it. That is what a brain emulation is like. And these are my working assumptions. And from here on, and in great detail in the book, I'm going to tell you about the age of M and what it's like, whether you like it or not. First of all, many things I can tell you are true about robots in general, not just these kind of robots. For example, robots can be represented by computer files so they can be made immortal, because you can archive files and make them immortal. Now, today houses and cars are in principle immortal in that if you keep repairing them, they can keep lasting indefinitely, but you don't keep repairing all of them, so because they can be immortal doesn't mean they are immortal. Computer files can be sent across the world electronically at the speed of light, so robots can travel across the world electronically at the speed of light. You are afraid that if we kill nature, you will die. It's a reasonable fear. Robots know, however, that if they accidentally kill nature because they are made in factories out of things dug up in mines, they do not die. They are less afraid of killing nature. They may save it or not, but they are less afraid. Copies can be made of computer files, so you can copy a robot at any one time and make another robot that starts out with exactly the same state. That makes everything different for the robot economy. Many of you may know of supply and demand for labor. Today, there's a great demand for your work, a limited supply of people like you, so the wages are high. But if we can make substitutes for human workers in factories as cheap and as fast as we can make other things we make in factories, wages fall to subsistence levels of the robots, which is below human workers, so wages are low. Even if the economy gets bigger, still wages stay low. We'll talk more about this in a minute. Today, to make things, you need both labor and capital, people and machines. The growth rate of an M economy can be different from our economy. Today, we can make machines really fast. We can crank them out of factories really fast. But there's not much point in having lots of machines with the same number of people. If we could make more people fast, then the economy could grow fast, but we don't double the number of people every 15 years like we're doubling the economy. So how do we double the economy every 15 years? We make better machines. That's how the economy is growing mainly today. But if you can make a substitute for a human worker in a factory, and you can just make them as fast as you make anything in a factory today, you can make the economy grow much faster by making lots of labor and lots of cable. So the economy can grow quickly without much innovation. It can just grow fast by making stuff. In fact, standard economic theory says the economy could double every month or faster. That's not crazy if you can just make stuff in factories. Now, if it takes a year to get to Mars and you double the economy every month, going to Mars looks a lot less attractive. So things that are far away will just be suppressed and set aside for the period when there's very fast growth. So this isn't an era of space travel. This is your life. You start and then you end. This is the life of an emulation who every day when they're ready for work, they make multiple copies who do short-term tasks and then only one copy goes on to the next day. Maybe they stand in line at the DMV. We'll talk more about that scenario. This is an emulation who's opportunistic. They make more copies of themselves when there's more demand for those copies and less of the ones there's less demand, and they don't know where their future's going to be, depending on where there's more copies wanted. This is a designer who conceives of an entire system and then breaks into copies who then design subsystems all the way down until they've designed all the details. So then this way, a single emulation can have a much larger, more coherent design, because they can conceive of the large vision and then manage all the details to be coherent. This is an emulation plumber who, every day when they were ready for work, made 1,000 copies, and then those 1,000 copies did a 2-hour plumbing job and only one of them went on to the next day. Objectively, this emulation is working over 99% of the time, but what they remember is a life of leisure. They only worked 2 hours a day, and the other 22 hours they had off. Looking back, they remember a life of leisure even though objectively working 99% of the time. We know of many complicated systems like the human brain and like most software projects that rot in the way software rots, i.e., as it becomes adapted to particular circumstances, it becomes harder to readapt for new circumstances. It becomes fragile. Human minds start out with fluid intelligence, like you guys have when you're young, and when you're older, like me, you have crystallized intelligence. You know more, but you can learn less. If the human brain is like this, like these other systems, this means that emulations will become fragile over subjective time, and even though they have potentially immortal life, they must retire after a subjective career of a century or two, perhaps, and be replaced by other copies who are trained in slightly newer ways and are still not as inflexible. They're more flexible. So emulations would see around them other copies of themselves who are younger and older than them. So they would have a very good idea of where their life is going. These older copies of them would show them what jobs they'll take and who they'll marry and what city they live in and all those things. And they won't be blindsided so much by things that happen in their life. They'll pretty much know where they're going. This is your life, again, you start and then you end. This could be your life if, at the beginning of a party, you took a drug that meant you would not remember that party the next day or ever after. Some people actually do this sort of thing. My question for you is, at the end of this party, will you say to yourself, this is terrible, I'm about to die. I was created as a new creature at the beginning of this party, and at the end of this party, this creature's about to die, my life is about to be over, I'm going to fight and scream and complain because I don't want to die. You could say that, or you could say, I am still the same creature as I will be tomorrow. That's still me. He just won't remember my experience now. I just won't remember what I did in the past. This is an emulation who splits off a short-term copy to stand in line at the DMV, and then that copy ends, or perhaps retires, after that task. This short-term copy could say to themselves, I'm a new creature. I was just created. I'm about to die. This is terrible. I hate this. I hate my life. Or they could say, I am a part of this larger creature who won't remember this part of what they did. I predict they'll have that second attitude, not because it's the correct attitude, it's because this is a competitive world, and in this world, that's a more productive attitude because it allows them to create these short-term copies, and for the short-term copies, they don't have to pay for the whole next evening of rest before they're ready for work the next day. It's a copy where you only pay for the work. And on that, we have a short commentary.
So Robin's picture is very descriptive, which is a very valuable effort, and we're very pleased he did it. There is another story you can tell, which is more about what we can change the future, rather than just what it looks like, but how to improve it. An interesting thing is that if you look at the impact of the different things we can do in the future, and you do some analysis there, you can find out things like global health interventions, or which startups you might fund as a venture capitalist. The distributions are not normal, but there's much of a power law involved. So the best being very many orders of magnitude better than most. If you're interested in a movement that's trying to prioritize improving the world, figuring out how to do the most good and do it, there is a group of people called Effective Altruism, and they're trying to do such a thing. People working in AI, or global catastrophic risks, or factory farming, or global poverty or more, making intellectual progress on what most impacts the future. So Europe, the reason I'm talking right now, is because Europe's annual meeting of these people is happening it's called the Effective Altruism Global X Conference, here in Oxford on the 18th to the 20th of November at the Examination Schools. That's over 450 coming in from around the world, places like Berlin and Switzerland and Berkeley in the US. So yeah, if you are joining organizations that are coming there, like intellectuals like the founders of DeepMind, entrepreneurs, philosophers like Derek Parker are coming along, and philanthropists. If you want to be in on this conversation, as well as this excellent one we're having this evening, you can apply to this conference at eagxoxford.com. That was EAGX, Effective Altruism Global X Oxford.com. And with that, your sponsored advertisement is ended.
Back to your regularly scheduled strange future. So, even if you're okay with making short-term copies who then end and not remembering what you did, the people you interact with might be disturbed if you talked with them and then later on you don't seem to remember what they talked to you about. So a way around that is for whole groups and teams of M's to be copied together, to work together, and then to end together as teams, even if it's a short time. Today, it's hard to meet with celebrities. Their time is limited. But for M's, it's easy to meet with celebrities. They just spin off a short-term copy who interacts with you, and then that copy ends. Anybody can talk to the president. The hard part is to get the president to remember what you said later. They'll have to maybe choose what to tell the original. But we can use this to an advantage. Today, if the president says we must invade Iraq, and you say, why? And they say, state secret, sorry, I can't tell you, you must trust me, you don't know whether to believe them. However, for an emulation, the leader can send a copy of themselves into the safe. You send a copy of yourself into a safe. Inside this safe, it's all closed off and they tell you their secret reasons. And at the end, you choose one bit to send out. Was I persuaded or not? One bit is sent out, everything's erased, and that's the end. And now you hear from yourself as if a few minutes ago, are you persuaded by their arguments for their claim? And now they can keep all of their state secrets, but you still get to decide whether to believe them. This world is dominated by emulations, but there are still a few humans left. They're just not the center of attention. Emulations are concentrated in a small number of very dense cities, and the humans get the rest of the world, but that's not where the action is. Humans must retire. Very soon, all humans lose their ability to earn wages by working. However, humans start out owning all of the capital of this world. They own all the buildings, all the real estate, all the patents. So if the economy doubles every month, the value of their investments also doubles every month. They own most of this world to start off, so humans collectively get very rich very fast. However, a large fractions of humans today own not much more than their ability to earn wages. In a scenario like this, you're in trouble if all you have is your ability to earn wages. So humans need to obtain sufficient assets, insurance, or sharing arrangements, or they're at risk of starving. My prediction is that since the ability to set up those sorts of things has varied enormously in history, it will vary again in the future. Some places will do it and some won't. Be warned. All emulations start out as humans initially. They all are with their characteristics in terms of personality and mental styles and attitudes. They're all within the human range, but they're not typical humans. The emulation economy, being very competitive, selects the most productive humans to make scans, to train, to make many copies of, to market. And so the typical emulation is not a typical human. In fact, most emulations are copies of the few hundred most productive humans. That makes emulations as elite compared to the typical human as the typical Nobel Prize winner, Olympic gold medalist, head of state, billionaire. That's the level of quality of the typical emulation. And they know it. They may look back on humans with nostalgia and gratitude, but not so much respect. We know ways in which more productive people today seem to differ from less productive people. We can just use those as straightforward, if weak, predictions about M characteristics. They will tend to be a workaholic, a morning larks, smart, conscientious. They're probably near a peak age of productivity, which for us is, say, near age 40 or 50. These are the features of emulations because these are the things we happen to know are correlated with productivity today, and they are selected for being the most productive in this new world. Most jobs in an advanced economy are desk jobs. For an emulation, you might as well put them in a virtual reality desk. No point in building a little physical desk for them. And as long as they're already on a computer, in virtual reality, they don't get dizzy. In fact, in virtual reality, they never need to have any pain, hunger, disease, grime. Their bodies are always beautiful. And it's very cheap to give them a luxurious virtual reality just compared to the cost of running their brains. So these are typical pictures of luxurious environments that emulations could easily have because they're cheap. However, notice these are all desks because they are, in fact, working most of the time. Workaholics in beautiful environments who never need pain and have beautiful bodies but are still working most of the time. When you were a child, some of you probably thought, you know what, I'm kind of weird. These people around me are not like that. I wonder if I'm from another planet. And someday I'm going to meet the other people from my planet. And then I'm going to find people I like and who'll get along with me because we're going to be the same sort of people. Now, for emulations, this is literally true. That is, most of them are copies of the few hundred most productive humans. Each of those humans then ends up with millions or billions of copies. And so they have this new unit of association, all the other copies of the same original me. They can use this new unit of association. They're more similar to them than today we are with identical twins or family members. And so this can be a unit for finance, for culture, for politics, for law. They can use this as a source of advice and comfort by all the copies of me. And they will be sad that you guys are all alone and don't have any copies of yourself to talk to. Now, one of the most traumatic things that ever happened to humans was the transition from foraging to farming. As foragers, humans were in rough equilibrium with their world. The things that just felt intuitively like the things to do were usually the right things to do. But when farming became possible, it required quite different behaviors. And so it was only because humans have a lot of strong cultural plasticity that we could create new cultures with new norms that tell people that new things are the things that need to be done. And farming world had enough conformity pressure and invented religion in order to get people to act in quite different ways as farmers. In the last few hundred years, we've gotten rich. And most of these pressures that turned foragers into farmers were dependent on farmers being poor. And as we get rich, those pressures feel less compelling, and so we have drifted back toward forager values. This plausibly explains many trends over the last few centuries, including increased democracy, less slavery, increased leisure, less religion, decreased fertility, increased travel, increased product and behavioral variety, etc. These are all ways in which foragers are different from farmers. Many people celebrate and like this trend, and they see a future where this continues. This trend to a more forager-like behaviors goes on, and we have a Star Trek or other sort of future where people are very rich and comfortable and indulge their personal preferences because that's what rich future people do. However, in the age of M, I predict for the emulations, they go back to more forager-like attitudes. They are no longer rich. They are again at subsistence wages, like almost everybody in history has ever been, including almost all animals. So it's not a strange hypothetical, it's the usual case in history. In that situation, they have a world that needs them to do behaviors that, again, don't feel natural to foragers. They're not quite the same behaviors, but they're different behaviors, so they do have a use of cultural pressures, conformity, and religion to get them to do these new ways. So I predict a return to more farmer-like attitudes with the age of the M. For the emulations, the humans, of course, can continue to be rich foragers because they don't have any jobs anyway, and they're retired. This is your life. You are young and you train, and you are peak productivity in middle age, and then you retire when you're older. Emulations have these same three phases of life, but they can train a small number of copies, and when they find the best trainees, make many, many copies of those. This allows them to put a lot more resources onto training. They can spend a lot of resources on getting trainees to be done just right. Then when they're working, of course, they want lots of copies of those to be working, and then when they retire, today if you retire and you don't have enough money, you starve. A poor emulation who retires, they can just retire slow. I told you they could run at different speeds, but if you run an emulation twice as fast, it costs twice as much over a wide range. So if you want to retire slow, then it's cheap. And so most emulations, if they haven't saved up a lot of money, they just become slow retiree. And all of a sudden the world around them speeds up. And they're more like the humans, seeing these fast emulation worlds speeding up around them. Emulations would pick speeds that match the jobs they're doing. So if you're interacting with a human, you can be slow like a human. If you're running a nanofactory, you might be fast like a nanofactory. If you're a boss, you're going to be faster. You're probably going to do leisure faster. It's actually a different world if you're fast or slow. To a fast emulation, most of the world is rock and granite, and you can go on the few tunnels through the mountain where things can change. If you're a slow emulation, it's a world of buzzing insects that you better not stick your fingers in. You have to find the places you can be slow. The same mental attitude, the same creature, has very different cultures. And in fact, these cultures can't really keep synchronized. If the fast people change their music every subjective year, or 10 years, the slow people, that would be every few minutes, and they just couldn't keep up. So they would have divergent cultures. Now, if you are interacting with humans, you would probably have a human-sized body because there's a rough mapping between the 10th of a second, which is the fastest time we can control our body parts, and the 10th of a second reaction time of our brain. Those are the same for a reason. So if you have a faster brain as an emulation, you need a smaller body so that it can be well matched to your brain. So faster emulations need smaller bodies if they have them, at least in virtual reality or real world, so that it feels natural to them. So you go 256 times faster, you have to be these little tiny creatures. Of course, your brain doesn't have to be in your body, you could teleoperate it, but you have this whole hierarchy, and plausibly it goes up to 1,000,000 times faster than humans, where you pay 1,000,000 times much and run 1,000,000 times faster. And it goes down slower too. And notice that faster M's are higher status in many ways. They embody more wealth, they learn things faster, they host meetings, they win arguments, they are just higher status. Not only that, the speeds clump. Just like we clump into a city to interact with others in the same city, emulations would clump to the same speed so they can interact with others at the same speeds. So it's a class hierarchy, a distinct class hierarchy of speed which the emulations live in. It's a legitimized hierarchy. Slow M's really have to admit that fast ones get a lot more done. Now, today we have a literary concept of a ghost, and most of the very slower emulations are retirees, and they're a lot like our literary concept of a ghost. So ghosts in literature are creatures who are all around and available to interact with, but nobody usually bothers. And if you were to find them and interact with them, they really can't influence very much. They're not up to date. They're kind of obsessed with old ways. And you mostly don't want to interact with them, because what's the point? And that's what most of these old slow retirees are like. A world of slow ghosts available to interact with that nobody wants to, for the most part. Unless it's that time of year to celebrate your ancestors and chat with them. So, again, you guys are all clumped into cities, but not all in one big city in the world. There are many cities in the world. Why? because as you make cities bigger, there are some disadvantages, and the main one is traffic congestion goes up as cities get bigger. But for emulations, they can interact with anyone in the same city without actually going there. They can just have a virtual reality interaction where all they do is send the bits that represent where they are in their room and how they move their lips and things like that. That's vastly cheaper than moving. And so they can have large cities that allow lots of interaction all across the city because they don't actually have to move. So most emulations can be in a small number of very large, dense cities. We know some things how to do that. Now today, in virtual reality, you can interact with anybody else on the Earth and not notice where they are because the light can go a 1/10 of a second all the way across the Earth. But if you're 16 times faster than humans, light only goes 1,000 kilometers in that time. And so you need to be that close in order to not notice where they are. And the faster you go, the closer you have to be before thus delays of the speed of light start to become noticeable. So this limits how fast emulations want to go. If they start going much more than 1,000 times the speed of a human, then they start to notice that even in a city where other people are. On the other hand, if they go much slower than 1,000 times human speed, then their careers are over before they could keep going, because in a month of doubling time, if you're going 1,000 times human speed, that's a subjective century. So that could be a reasonable clear, but if you're much slower, it doesn't. So this says emulations probably run roughly 1,000 times human speed. That's a sweet spot between these two factors, and that's my best guess about emulation speed. Some of you write software. You've noticed and been told that over the last decades, the cost of computer hardware has fallen enormously compared to the cost of software engineers. Because of that, we've moved in terms of trade-off to use a lot more computer hardware compared to people. We use higher level languages, more tools, more abstraction, etc. But once emulations show up, now the software engineers are made out of the same kind of hardware as the computers, and now the relative cost of the engineers to the hardware goes way down, so we have a sudden back to the future moment where we go to some past trade-off between hardware and the engineers, and then it stays at that level for parallel software. And it even goes backwards in time for serial hardware, because serial hardware doesn't improve as fast as parallel hardware, and emulations are very parallel, so that's all they need. Today, we have a lot of kinds of inequality, and we have a power law to describe it. And so we can use the power greater than 1 to describe things where it's relatively low inequality. Most of the weight is in many small things. And an alpha here, a parameter less than 1 to describe it when there's a lot of inequality. Most things are concentrated into a small number of things, and alpha equals 1 is in the middle. Today, firms and cities and nations are all spread out relatively equally across the different scales. Products tend to be more concentrated. Most product markets are dominated by a few players. Families and wealth is more equally distributed, and the richest person today only owns 0.02% of the world's wealth. 1,000 years ago, this was much more equal. There were fewer big cities and nations and firms because there were fewer big units. In the future, plausibly, firms stay spread out across different sizes. Product markets are again concentrated, but now city-states are much more concentrated. Again, they're all in a few big cities. Families are also more concentrated because of this few hundred dominate most of the thing, and wealth also becomes probably more concentrated, because today we have rags to rags in 3 generations, as future generations don't continue the habits of other people, but because M's can have indefinite lifespans, they can continue their good wealth habits over a longer time scale and produce more inequality. So this is my last slide. I know from giving this talk 81 times now that you are eager to evaluate this world, to decide whether you like it or not. But pause and think, your ancestors from 1,000 years ago, if they had heard about your world, they would have loved it or hated it, depending on the first few things they heard. Your world is just weird and complicated from their point of view. And that's how you should expect the future to be. You shouldn't expect to be able to evaluate it easily on the basis of the first few things you hear. You should buy my book or do something to get involved and see the world in great detail before you make a judgment like that. But I know you're eager to make the judgment, so let me make a summary list of things you might consider in your judgment. First of all, they're mostly in virtual reality where there's no pain, hunger, disease, grit. Their bodies are always beautiful. They're less afraid of death, whether they should be or not is a different question, but they don't mind. Vast population, all of whom find their lives worth living for the most part. If you ever said, I couldn't live in a small town because there's not enough going on there, that's what they say about your cities. Their cities are larger, more intricate, more specialization, and yours look small and boring. They have a larger economy to pay for more stories, art, drugs even, other things that make a fixed cost to make more variety. The more of that variety is available. Compared to you, they are virtuous and able. Again, billionaire, Nobel Prize winner. They're on average that quality compared to you, and their world to them seems more stable. On the other hand, like almost everybody in history, most of them live near a subsistence wage. That's the income they get, pretty much all of them. They work long hours, workaholics. They often have these short-term copies that end. They don't mind, but you might. More wealth inequality, more class inequality by speed, bigger, more bureaucratic firms, more layers of middle management, perhaps less nature, less space travel, less democracy, more religion. This is the age of M. It's not my job to make you like it. It was my job to tell you what seems most likely if you did the least to avoid it. You don't like it, do something about it. That's it. We're going to have questions, and there's somebody with a microphone, so when you raise your hand, wait for the microphone.
So aren't there two possible kinds of sources for the emulation, either a destructive read or a non-destructive read? And how much does that sort of change this story? Because most people won't, I don't know, it might change the story a lot.
So scans, you need to scan a brain to produce an emulation, and the scans can either be destructive, destroying the brain in the process, or non-destructive. Obviously, all else equal, you'd choose the non-destructive. However, all else is not likely to be equal. Especially in the early era, most likely only destructive scans are available. This certainly affects the early transition, though not necessarily the later period of this era. Not only will they be destructive, at the very first, the M world will be looking for people at the peak of their career, software engineers, lawyers, et cetera, and getting those to be copied because they are the most valuable to sell immediately. But as the M world starts to change and be different than the human world, they very quickly don't want the best people in the human world. They want younger, more people with potential who can learn the new ways of the emulation world. So they would start to get younger and younger quickly, and then the M world is starting to find human children with great potential to destructively scan. So you have the scenario of the rich M capitalists approaching parents of promising human children and saying, could we destructively scan your child because they have potential in the emulation world? That's got to have a lot of potential for drama, but I predict it'll happen. There's huge economic forces here, and yes, some people will let their child be scanned to become an emulation. That's my prediction, like it or not. There's a question in the back. There's several here. Keep the hands up so you can see where you are.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is about those that have nothing to give except for their labor. What would become of them?
Those who have nothing to sell but their labor.
Yes. What would become
And if they heard my warning and did nothing, then they are at the mercy of the charity of others. And if nobody else sympathizes enough with them to help, they starve. Not my job to like it. I'm just going to tell you what happens. That seems to be a pretty safe prediction. You don't have resources, you don't have income, nobody helps you, you starve. That's it. Other hands?
Thank you, Robin. Absolutely fascinating talk. I have a question for you. Most people might also know you as the author of the Great Filter Hypothesis. And in this talk, you talk about M's being infinitely replicable. They can be copied at will, at leisure, and very cheaply in this world, which would seem to make them the ideal agent for, let's say, colonization of space and so on. And yet, we don't see them.
Yep.
How do those two strands to your thought sit together? Do you find them mutually contradictory, perhaps?
If you had thought that robots were impossible and that we'd always stay biological humans, you might have thought, the reason that nobody's traveled between the stars is fragile creatures like ourselves just can never get between the stars. It's just too hard. Once you see that our descendants could be much like us and be much more hardy and robust and cheap and easy to send between the stars, it's more puzzling why they haven't moved between the stars. So then you might say, gee, the great filter is more of a problem. It's more of a problem I must face and think about. That's pretty much all this says about the great filter, because even though this is the next great era after ours, these people are more like what an advanced civilization would like that you found in the universe, but they're still not very much like it. Almost anything we found in the universe as an advanced civilization will be millions and billions of years past the point where we are. And imagining what in detail they're like is extremely hard. But you just know they'd be out there doing something, using the resources. That's it.
So you make a lot of somewhat speculative assumptions in order to flesh out your world. Could you put a point estimate on how likely you think this scenario would be? Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty, but...
So the main dominant effect on a point estimate is the dimensionality of the space I'm giving. That is, the more things I say, the less likely the conjunction of those gets. And it gets ridiculously unlikely very fast. So I could say 1 in a billion or 1 in a trillion, and it would just depend on how many of these things I put in the list. But that's not a very interesting way to talk about it. It's more important to say, well, almost always when we do all sorts of analysis of complicated things, we do tend to pick a point estimate, and then we reason about a cloud implicitly of things around that point estimate. And we ask, how good is a point estimate as a guide to action? And it doesn't make much sense to ask how probable is a point estimate because it's just one point in a space. So then we might ask, how likely is this to be informative, for example? So in the book, I give 2 numbers, which I'm not sure I'm that tied to, but I say, unconditionally, I'd say there's a 10% chance of what I've described being relevant enough to be a guide to action. And conditionally on M showing up, I say there's a 30% chance of it being relevant enough to be a guide to action. And I think those are in the ballpark sort of estimates. Of course, if you say, no, I mean, add the conjunction of all these things in one long description, of course, I'm going to say, duh, that's low. In the book, I say less than 1 in 1,000, but of course, we know much less than 1 in 1,000. And I'd really like to have betting markets on these things. I think that would be a much more informative way to lay out the probabilities and lay it out. I don't think I'm going to be very persuasive to you in throwing a number at you, because you'll say, what's his number? Where does that come from? There was a hand right next to you, I thought. Where's she standing?
One of your key assumptions is efficiency. And yet, obviously, we see that breaking down in lots of ways in our current world. So how do you think that assumption might be violated, and how would that affect your conclusions?
As I claimed in an early slide, if you were trying to understand a subsistence farmer from thousands of years ago, efficiency would be a pretty good guide to understanding much of their behavior. It's not a perfect guide, but it's pretty good. But then I'm not looking for a perfect guide here. That's not even an option. I'm quite happy to just have a rough guide that's in the ballpark. So for each thing, if you assume they're doing the efficient thing, I think that helps you to get in the ballpark, as long as you know this won't be exactly right. There'll be some things in which they don't do efficient things. Now, for example, for those farmers from 1,000 years ago, one of the ways they might be inefficient is they were very slow at adopting innovations that came from elsewhere. So you might say, well, maybe people are efficiently using the technology they're familiar with, but slow at adopting other things, then you will be more careful about predicting fast adoption. But then I am being careful about that here. So I think we already do know some things about what's more efficient than others. Also, another way things go is that efficiency is usually with respect to the criteria you understand. And most inefficient behavior is really because when you model it, you're missing some other considerations that you aren't taking into account. Once you take those other things into account, you get a more close correspondence, but then you don't know all the things that are relevant, and so that's one of the main reasons. So I think it's less about whether efficiency is correct or not, and more about how much do we understand the main drivers of a lot of behaviors. And there are many things where we only partially understand why people do things certain ways. And that's really what's getting in the way of analyzing this.
So the initial investment for turning people into M's would be very expensive. So that means you'd want a return on investment, and that means you'd want to kind of privatize this being that you're creating, if we can call it a being. That kind of leads to the fact that you want to, because you're privatizing it and you're keeping control over it, it won't be able, if you consider it as a software where you can go around and copy it, you might want to try and prevent copying, and it would be kind of like a kidnapping, because if someone else copies your M that they haven't invested in so much, you would lose out. So would you ever release the M into the wild, onto the internet, to be able to fulfill its full potential, or would you create enclaves of M's that work for you? This is in a purely capitalistic sense.
So there's a lot of things to say in response to this. First, we don't know how much copying will be a dominant early cost. It might be that the scanning technology is one of the things that happens to be good enough early, and by the time the other things are ready, scanning is pretty cheap. So it might be at the very beginning that the scanning cost is actually not much of a cost. Nevertheless, there are other costs. So in addition to scanning an M, you need to train them. And then if they seem to be promising, you need to market them. And then you need to add other capital and support. So in the end, for almost all new kinds of workers, there are other expenses that are cost to do that. Now, some people could just be billionaires and pay for themselves to be copied. Other people would agree to be copied and perhaps destructively agree, and they will need to see some promise or believe that they'll have an okay life. So whatever capitalists are approaching this worker and saying, could we scan you and train you to do these things, they will need to offer some assurances that you're not just going to be a slave who is tortured all the time to work for them, that you're going to have a better life. And that will presumably mostly be by seeing other previous workers and how they're treated, so that you can see this is okay with you. So then there's a negotiation as usual between labor and capital about the terms of the agreement, what the wages are, but what the degree of commitment is, and what the exit options are if you don't like it, what working conditions are, things like that. And this is just a negotiation where offers are made and people accept some offers and reject other offers, and in the end there's some sort of compromise made on these various terms. And predicting the details of that compromise seems hard, but it just would have to be a compromise that both sides found acceptable. And that's the straightforward prediction. Whoever is doing this kind of roughly expects what happens, and mostly what they expected is what happens, and they're mostly okay with it.
So 2 different questions. The first one, do you see really high rates of depression in your prediction among humans? Because the M's are so much better than the humans, how do they compete? And then the second unrelated question is, how would things like organized crime play into this? I mean, are people trying to steal M's? And I mean, how would you sort of view this scenario playing out? Thank you.
Okay, so for the first question, we have a number of analogs to think in terms of. One is retirees today. People often retire, and when they retire, they are no longer needed at work. And if they think of it that way and frame it that way, they can be, it's a downer that the world doesn't want me anymore. But people often don't frame it that way. They take the initiative to say, I've had to work all this time, and now it's my turn to do what I want with my life. And they embrace this freedom as embodying their choice and their autonomy. And they are not depressed. They are having fun golfing or traveling or whatever, because now they're retired and getting to do what they want. So humans also have the choice of how to frame this option. Today, of course, so in addition to humans deciding what to do with their retirement, they can also decide, do I want to become an M? So it's most likely vastly cheaper to be an M than a human. So if you're a poor human, you could still be a rich M. And as an M, you have lots more options. You can make copies of yourself. You can travel electronically. You can live in beautiful worlds. So many people will just choose to become an M. And as an M, they could choose to work again. Although they may not be competitive, they could subsidize themselves and work and then find their life meaningful. So that's still an option. Or they could retire. So those are the range of options. Basically, usually people find a way to think about what they're doing so that it's okay. Because people don't like to be depressed, and cultures find ways to tell people they're okay. In terms of organized crime, we have all the usual kinds of crime that would continue on. Mere physical theft is possible. Assault is possible. Wars are possible. Slander is possible. There's just all the sorts of things people can do to each other continue to be possible here. But it's most likely a relatively peaceful world. We only spend a small fraction of our income in our world protecting ourselves against crime and transfer versus crime. Even war is a relatively small fraction, so I have to say probably a small fraction of effort is spent on war and defending against war, theft and defending against theft. They're okay with most of that, and murder is much less of a problem because they make backups frequently. It's probably, if you spend 1% of your wages on making backups, you can make a backup every subjective 5 minutes. So you can just have backups all the time. Somebody kills you, 5 minutes back, you're back again, so it's not a problem. But they are terrified or hate mind theft, this sort of kidnapping, because, as was suggested, if somebody steals a copy of your mind, they could torture it to get your secrets, they could try lots of things to figure out how to persuade you of things, they could make copies of it to compete with you and take away your wealth. It's just a threat on many different levels, so people will dislike mind theft and have great outrage. It'll be one of the great villains of their stories, because that's a terrible thing to do. And that's not something we're familiar with, but that's one of their main villains, and things they hate is theft and less murder.
Hi. Do M's communicate in a language that resembles anything like human language or computer language that we have at the moment?
So M's start out as humans like us, psychologically all the way down the line. So the moment after they're turned on, They speak whatever language they spoke the moment before they're turned on, i.e. the moment before they were scanned. Now the question is, how does language evolve and change in this world? And for that you need to know, how does language vary with context? What are the main things that we know about how language varies with context? We're pretty sure people aren't just going to start speaking computer code to each other. That's not the sort of thing we see humans doing to each other. It seems unlikely M's would do it. But one thing I do say in the book, which I think is a robust pattern, which is larger societies have larger vocabularies. That is, one of the things that languages do is they evolve to create more distinctions that are more relevant to a society, and the larger a society is, the more they accumulate. Larger societies also accumulate more language details, like subject and clauses and all the complicated language features. Larger communities just generate more of those. So they would have a more complicated grammar with more complicated rules and structures and a larger vocabulary. So they could actually have more kinds of feelings than you do. Literally, because there's a sense in which your range of feeling is limited by having a limited range of words to describe what you feel. And you're often struggling to find words to describe, and when you find a word that says what you feel, that feels empowered to have that feeling and remember that feeling, because now you have a word for it. So M's would really just feel more than you.
Just out of curiosity, how does procreation work in the M world? Is it that they're reliant on human beings to continue the physical act of having children and then bringing them into the M world, or is there a way that it happens there?
So the entire M era only lasts a year or two. During that era, there's just not much time for humans to create more babies. Humans are just limited. So it's pretty much limited to the supply of children that are available at the moment this starts. And then the M world will be going through all those children, looking for who's promising and scanning them, and eventually getting all of them when it's non-destructive, and then looking for the ones of those that are best. And that's the pool they're limited to. Eventually they might find ways artificially to vary these scans they have to create new artificial creatures, and then it's more about the artificial versions they created. But initially they're just stuck with the number of humans. And initially all they can do is make copies. So they reproduce by copies. So sex for them is no longer about reproduction, even less so than in our world. Sex for them is just about social contact and bonding and all those sorts of things. But reproduction is through copying. So farming societies and our ancestors often had very strong social norms about sex because it was the way to control reproduction. Reproduction was important, so sex was important. And they had strong ways to repress sex that was out of control in order to make sure reproduction happened their way. Plausibly, the M world will have a bunch of really anal rules about reproduction and making copies that we don't understand. All of their hang-ups will be about copying and less about sex, and it's really kind of hard to imagine all the hang-ups they'll have about copying, but I expect they'll be there. So strong social norms and rules about who you're allowed to copy with and when and how, and I can't even imagine what that is, but they'll come up with it.
So I just want to, something that was touched on earlier about property and who, if anyone, owns M's. Do they own themselves? You talked about them being paid wages, which suggests that they will, at least to some degree, own themselves. But at the same time, when you make copies of an M, particularly if it's a short-lived copy, presumably it doesn't own all its wages, which are then, I don't know, maybe you inherit them. You're the next of kin if it's your copy. How do you see that? I mean, so ownership of software is already quite complex when it can just be copied infinitely. How do you see that?
So when we look at history and different times and places, we can use basic efficiency to say a lot of things about the world. When they reap, when they sow, what they make, how their clothes are. Efficiency predicts all of those things, and I'm using efficiency to predict a lot of things. Who owns what is harder to predict with efficiency reasons. Therefore, it's harder to make predictions about that. The same civilization in the same place doing the same things, you could have free workers, or you could have them doing pretty much the same thing as slaves. And to a first approximation, it doesn't make that much difference, which means it's hard to predict which way it goes. But to a second approximation, there are some things we can say. First of all, in history, slavery mainly was valuable when wages were above subsistence. When wages are up subsistence, it costs you as much to feed a slave as it does to hire a free worker. There's not much difference. So what's the point? Also in history, we've often had harsh treatment of slaves, mainly when they did very simple physical tasks for which they needed to push through the pain. Where when you have complicated jobs in a complicated economy, they were not treated harshly because that was just not very useful at making them more productive. So even if M's were slaves, they would not be harshly treated slaves because that's just not productive in a modern, complicated economy. But nevertheless, ask yourself, the threat of treating a slave harshly might motivate them, but it also, being a slave is sort of demotivating. what's the best way to motivate your workers? Again, these are not ordinary people in our world. These are peak productivity people, right? These are people that you're making millions and billions of copies because they're just the very best. You ask, what are those people motivated by? Those people are probably just ambitious people who want to do it, and probably making them a slave just kind of spoils the whole attitude thing, and you don't bother. But I don't know very confidently because, honestly, you all could be slaves and the society around you would function pretty much the same. It's not like slavery changes that much in the rest of society, which means it's hard to predict whether a society has slaves or not. But in history, slavery has been relatively rare. Even the Roman Empire, or even the US, roughly only 10% less were slaves. And so even in a world with a lot of slaves, like history, still you'd be only thinking that's percentage of slaves.
Yes. Do you have any idea of what these emulations might be producing?
Yes. So this is really simple. A subsistence economy where most people are living near subsistence, most of all the activity is spent producing the minimum need to subsist. So, animals who need, who are predators, who need prey to subsist, they spend most of their time being predators, pursuing prey. A subsistence farmer from 1,000 years ago, what they needed to exist was food and shelter and heat, clothing, and a little transport to move things around, and that's what they spent most of their time doing, is those basic things needed 1,000 years ago. So in the emulation economy, what are they doing? Most of the work is spent producing what they need to subsist. They need computer hardware, they need structural support, they need real estate, they need protection, they need energy, they need cooling, they need people to write, new algorithms to do things differently. That's where most of the economy is spent doing those things because that's what they need to survive, and a subsistence economy spends most of its effort on subsistence.
Thanks very much, Robin. So I was modeling your whole project as taking the assumption that human brains can be consider them a black box, and you can upload them and store them in relatively compact amounts of hardware, and then let's just take that assumption and run with all of the basic theory. So that suggests to me two questions, which is one, you went to lots of different areas of theory and tried to see how well you could extend them. Did you learn anything useful about lots of different areas of research? Were there any that were surprisingly amenable to predicting the future? Were there some of them that were less useful for this? I know you got a lot of returns out of going into physics. And also, were you thinking about other different assumptions? And do you other areas you'd be interested in seeing people trying the same sort of project?
So to the first question, my exercise was applying theory from many different areas. I had to learn more areas. So, this is a way, if you have to describe an entire civilization to people who don't know anything about the civilization, you realize there's all these different things in civilization you haven't been thinking about and need to learn the basics of so you can even start to talk about it. So that was, for me, this was a prod to generalize and to make sure I covered more areas that I hadn't learned before so that I could learn about those things so I could talk about it in the book. Now, academic and intellectual areas vary in their degree of abstraction. Some areas are really quite context dependent, where they're focused on particular context and figuring out what happens in that context, and that makes it hard to generalize. And I need insights that are relatively generalizable so that I can move them to this new context. And so that means I focused on academic areas where they seem to be making claims that would generalize to this context. And so many areas I couldn't. So didn't make much use of art history. Just don't have much there that I could use. But to the extent I could find generalizations, I would be happy to apply them. And this is somewhat a random application of things I learned or was able to learn. And somebody who knew other areas, they might say more things about other areas, and it would be great. I hope weekly that not just doing this will say, ooh, good job, Robin, that I could inspire other people to try this somewhere else. That is, as I say, there has been relatively little futurism of this sort, and many people think this is impossible. And partly I'm saying, no, this is possible, not only possible, straightforward. All you have to do is learn it off the different fields, and then pick a scenario, a set of assumptions, and say, this is my scenario, and then go with it, and analyze the heck of it, and figure out what happens there. So I hope people pick other scenarios, and I don't that much care which scenario, except that they pick ones that this analysis technique is amenable to, i.e. that they can say things about, and that they're interesting. I actually just got a grant from the Open Philanthropy Foundation to analyze a different scenario using the similar style. And this other scenario is actually a more conservative scenario than this one, perhaps, which is to say, assume that the way we've been accumulating software for the last 70 years just continues until we get human-level artificial intelligence, i.e. no revolution, no great change. We just keep accumulating more better software the way we've been doing. That's a straightforward reference scenario. If you believe there'll be some sort of revolution that will deviate from that, great, but the reference scenario will be a thing you can refer to define more precisely how it is you think the future will be different from that, so you can say more clearly, revolution in what exactly? Because most people are relatively unclear. Someday AI will be here and it won't be like ordinary software, it will be AI software and they don't say what. They just say it'll be different. Therefore it'll happen sooner, therefore it'll be better, therefore it won't have all the usual problems. So that's what I was getting at.
Could you comment briefly on what you think might happen in terms of if some of the M's were to evolve rather quickly and go into, you know, like what Nick Bostrom would term as like a super intelligence, and how that might really kind of change the dynamics of the whole emulation world if some were to, you know, accelerate rather rapidly early on?
So a lot of people have this intuition that, you know, social science as we know it is really fragilely describing humans. And once you get a creature who's not very human in some ways, everything is off and you don't know anything. Sort of a fragile sort of edge at which that we fall off the face of the earth and go into some strange new universe. I actually think ordinary social science is more robust than that, and many features of our world are more robust than that. Our world would have, has features that other creatures who aren't like us would also have. In fact, most economic theory is actually about a pretty alien kind of creature who's very rational and never forgets anything and can look all the way down all possible strategy lines. That's how most economic theory is, and in fact it works pretty well because many features of society don't actually depend that much on those details of the way humans are different from abstract creatures. So that's an introduction to say, when somebody says, what happens if humans evolve and become very different, I want to know, oh, different in which ways? So if you could give me a specific way in which they're different, then I can start to turn the crank and say, what does theory say about how creatures like that? How does a world of creatures like that be different? So one chapter I have in the book is in fact about intelligence, where I say, so many people have asked me, let me tell you, what happens if humans get more intelligent? How does the world change? And my first cut is to say, really, not that much changes. Intelligence doesn't actually change very many things in what I've told you in this talk so far. There's a modest number of things intelligence changes, but not that much. Intelligence allows the same person to have a wider span of jobs, allows them to more quickly change jobs, presumably allows one person to do more, holding other things constant. There's a number of things we know about how, what varies with who does jobs when they're more intelligent, or how the trade-off between training and learning on the job and things like that vary with intelligence, so there are a few degrees of that, but mostly, almost everything I have here goes along just fine when the creatures are more intelligent than humans. Intelligence doesn't make that much difference.
What if they were to, I mean, it seems like if I were to upload myself as an M, the first thing I would do is try to tackle certain types of, cognitive biases that I have and almost try to transform myself into Homo economicus and then start trying to progress in that way.
But you've already probably been trying that before you became an M.
Not as fast now, though.
And it's just really hard, and it's going to be hard for the M's too. So just because they're M's doesn't mean they can wish themselves to overcome their foibles. They're just going to have all the usual foibles we have. Mainly it's human brains are just enormously complicated and opaque, and merely being electronic doesn't make you understand that mess, and it doesn't give you any easy way to modify and improve it. You still have this arbitrary. So as an analogy, we have enormous legacy software systems today. Most big companies who use software have these huge pieces of software system they've inherited from the past, and it's actually quite hard to change. Even though it's trivially easy to take any old legacy software system, take any piece of code and change it, practically it's actually very hard to change the code because it's hard to change something in a way that other things are consistent with and have an improvement. That's just the nature of large, complicated software systems today. So that was probably the way for brains in the future. Yes, you're electronic, it's a mess, you don't understand it. When you make small modifications, they don't seem to help that much, and there you are. You're still biased, and you don't know what to do.
You said you thought that the age of M would only last a couple years. Is that because you have some idea of what will bring it to an end?
So my main heuristic is to say we've seen this set of previous ages, And they've had a relatively consistent number of doublings that eras have gone through before another era showed up, say 7 to 15 doublings. So I'm willing to say this next era could go through 7 to 15 doublings. I'd say by the time you get to 15 doublings or so, now you're starting to get to a longer number of doublings than we see before something else happens, at which point I say, I should expect something else to happen to make a big change, and I don't know what, so I'll shut up and stop there. Because I'm trying to, again, I'm trying very carefully to be speculative in the sense of not just shutting up and saying nothing about something I could say things about but not be entirely confident, but I am trying to reach a limit where I say, okay, at that point, I know so little, I'm going to shut up and stop there. I'm trying to show you that I have some degree of judgment about saying more than most people have, but not saying things when I don't know.
So in science fiction, there's a lot of discussion over the idea of a hive mind or a collective consciousness. So would you speculate that these emulations would eventually lead up to that collective consciousness?
Of course, these phrases and descriptions are used because they are so politically and emotionally potent, because we are very proud of our autonomy and separation, although we are, in fact, from the point of view of most animals, hive minds. I mean, just literally. Humans compared to other animals, we are social animals. We are very high degrees of coordination, very high degrees of interdependence. We are hives. Nevertheless, we are aware of the ways in which we are separate and distinct. Emulations will have, the ways that we are hive minds is because we have large organizations. That is, compared to our ancestors, we have larger cities, larger firms, larger clubs. This is the way we are becoming hive minds, is by creating these forms of organization that make us more interdependent on each other and more sharing and more willing to give up our autonomy to the organizations that we're part of. Emulations continue to develop bigger, better organizations with more complex arrangements, so they are in that way more hive minds. In addition, this new unit of the clan, now they have a choice, which is not entirely hard to see where they go, of trusting their clan mates more. So, you know, if I split off a copy and he's 5 minutes ago he was me, and now he says, you need to believe me about this, and he tells me something, I'm probably just gonna believe this guy. Because I believe we have such a common interest that it's very unlikely he's gonna lie to me about something, and therefore there's a high degree of trust among very recent copies. If it was a year ago or 20 years ago, now I'm not so sure how much I trust them. I trust them more than a random person, but less than others. So there's a ambiguous degree to which close copies will be more hive-like, in the sense that they will just believe each other when they tell each other things.
But what about the idea of uploading a consciousness to a big hive?
So, again, we have these brains, and we make a copy of the brain, but it's a black box. And in this we have these black boxes. Now, if you take black boxes and just stick them next to each other, it doesn't change the fact that they're black boxes. You might say, no, I want to mix them together and like take off the side of the box and squish them, but now you just don't know what you're doing. You're just making a mess out of spaghetti code, right? In order to interestingly integrate them, you have to understand them better. So at the beginning, they're just black boxes. Because they're black boxes, you don't know how to change them to make them more combined. That is, you can't, maybe you can do some simple things like add memory or take away visual processing you don't need. You can make some simple modifications, but they are still separate, and because they're complicated messes that you don't understand, you can't really integrate them. So like today, you have two pieces of software you like a video game, and then you like Microsoft Word, and you say, what happens if I merge Microsoft Word in this video game? And you say, please, software engineer, just merge them, please. And they go, I'm gonna put two files next to each other, what do you want me to do exactly? No, I want them integrated and merged, because I want them to have a collective conscious, or collective software. And they go, I can't do that. These are big, complicated things, and I just can't merge them together. You have to understand them better to even start to combine them together.
Regarding your earlier answer about having this ambition that many people will follow in your footsteps.
Just one, I'll take one.
Just one. But what advice would you give to anyone attempting this? How did you choose which fields to learn about and use in your book? And how did you go about learning those fields?
Well, honestly, there are many people who are inclined to be intellectual, and then there are those who succeed at being an intellectual, and the successful ones are often people more willing to set aside their interest in a wide range of topics to focus on one or a few topics such that they can get academic prestige and credibility in those few topics. So there are many people who are on the margins of academia and intellectual worlds who are really quite smart and quite intelligent. You can talk to them and they're insightful, but they just weren't willing to focus enough to become a success in academia. because they really want you to be focused and do one thing really well. Those are great candidates for this sort of task because this is a task that requires that breadth of knowledge and interest that many people refuse to give up, and they even sacrifice an intellectual career because they so much want to be broad. That's the ideal person, is somebody who can't resist learning a lot of fields and using them, because that's what I can use here. Also, of course, it probably is better to do this not at the very beginning of your intellectual career, but after you've actually learned a number of fields. Because if you don't know the basics of a number of fields, you can't learn them quickly. So the more things you know, the more you can more quickly learn other fields because they're similar. So this is probably a task for someone mid-career and not early. So after you've learned a number of things, and because you can't help it, you just like it, you learned a lot of things, now you are ready to maybe think about describing an entire world from the point of view of some particular assumption. That would be my best guesses.
So I was interested because I was thinking you explicitly wanted to model brains as black boxes, but you mentioned that what were you drawing on for the legacy? Because you said that it's very difficult to in fact figure out what's going on in big pieces of code.
Right.
But I would expect a significant difference from our main interface with human brains being talking with them or poking them medically to actually having them as code. I would still expect the rate at which we understood the thing and be able to play with the thing and learn what was going on and maybe change it to increase.
But today with real legacy software systems, you have all these advantages that you're talking about. You can interact with them as a user, but you can expect the code. You can try out variations, random variations on the code and see what happens. Even today with legacy software systems, you have all of those abilities that you're looking forward to having with brains. Nevertheless, you can ask anybody who is a regular user of trying to improve legacy software systems. They are in fact very hard to improve. They're even hard to understand. That is, they understand at some abstract level the basic ideas, but understanding enough to actually make an effective change is very hard for legacy software systems. So I'm basically making this analogy with just large legacy systems, saying, when you deal with a large legacy system, understanding the basic principles and rough ideas, just not enough. You have to add a lot. You have to do a lot. So that's roughly what I'm saying. I don't believe the brain is this simple thing with 5 equations that describes the whole thing. I think it's this huge mass of lots of little hacks that together function as one big system. But there isn't a few little things to learn. There's lots and lots of little things to learn.
Hi. As luck would have it, I'm somebody who does take apart legacy software systems for a living. So,
and you say?
And I would say what would make that a lot easier would be to have a lot of very intelligent software engineers and a lot of users, and therefore having a lot of parallel people that I can throw at this of different types would increase that process. So again, it seems like you would
have a hard problem, you add a lot more effort, you can solve a hard problem with more effort that you can solve with less effort.
Yeah. So it seems like you would rapidly get to a point where you had a much better understanding of the brain because it's electronic, you can look at it, you can model it better. I'm not sure what my point is.
So better, but the question is how much better, basically.
Yeah,
right.
And how much faster, I suppose.
But there's also the question of, many people just presume that if eventually you understand brains better and you are able to modify it substantially, they presume that most familiar features of humans disappear as being irrelevant, inefficient things. And this is a concern many people have. That is, we know that we fall in love, we joke, we play, we do art. There's just lots of things that humans do that when we tell ourselves are useless. But of course, we evolved to do them for a reason. They are not actually useless, but we get ourselves into a mental mode where we're playful about them, and we tell ourselves they're not important, they don't actually matter, but we just like doing them, and that's how we like the attitude toward them. And so many people, when they're in that mode and they think, well, what if a robot was competing with me? Oh my God, it wouldn't be playful like I am, therefore it would beat me out, and the things that win would no longer be playful, and all the things that we value about humans disappear. So in order to draw the conclusion that love and play and creativity all disappear and we become stupid, mindless robots, which is the classic fear, you have to not just be able to modify minds, you have to believe that most of these features of human minds are useless, irrelevant appendages to be lopped off when convenient. I don't believe that, though. I believe a lot of the major features of the human mind, including major features of how we interact socially, are robust features of being social creatures in a world like our ancestors have been in. So I think modified minds will still want to do those things in similar ways, perhaps not exactly the same way, because they are useful. And so this is part of believing, You play, you enjoy, you love, but these are actually things that matter. Your ancestors evolved these things at great expense for a reason. They're useful.
So one of the assumptions was that there's lots and lots of computer power available. So given that, I don't understand, first of all, why the M's need an income at all, because it's basically free to keep them alive and to put them in these computer-generated virtual environments. And second of all, what's the incentive to, so a lot of those hypotheses involve creating these short-lived copies. What's the incentive of deleting them? Once you create them, just let them keep on enjoying life in some simulated environment. So why do we keep on having to delete them and pay for them to exist?
So computing might be very cheap, and so it's a low expense compared to us to give them hardware and energy and cooling, but it's not free. All of these things cost something, and very strong basic economic arguments say when there's a very large supply of workers who are very cheap to create, the value of the marginal worker falls to the cost of making them, so that at that point, they have to work most of the time to just barely earn enough to pay for the things they need. So it might be a penny a year, but they have to work most of the time to earn the penny a year. So they are working, even though it's cheap, because that's just the nature of what happens when the population can expand quickly. It just expands until that point where wages fall to subsistence levels. Remind me of your second. Oh, okay. So again, it's a cost. Now, if you're willing to, like I said, at 1% of the usual wages, you can probably archive a copy every 5 minutes. That archive copy, however, isn't running. So subjectively, from its point of view, the world is happening extremely fast, right? These 2 years that a human might experience, that for the M's are thousands of years, to this archived copy might be a few seconds. So you might ask, well, is that good enough? Fine. So yes, any M's who are at all stressed about the idea of ending, you say, oh no, you're not ending, you're just gonna go slower, really slow. But now if they say, in the next few seconds, there might be a revolution war and then I'll die, now they've stressed again, well, you haven't comforted them very much, so it depends on what their attitudes are about that. But I think many of them will just be okay, fine. What do I need with all these billions of copies archived copies I've been collecting? We're almost all identical with each other with slight variations. That just starts to sound silly. But some might do it and some won't, but again, it's cheap, so it doesn't matter. So my main prediction is that they will do the things they need to survive and that are efficient. When there are cheap things they can do that don't make that much difference to cost, I say, I don't know if they do it or not, because hey, it's cheap. So some of them are fine with some of them are stressed by ending, but okay with just very slow copies. They get very slow copies.
Talking about the personal identity problems with copies, you've touched on the fact what an M might worry about when they know that they're a copy, that they might worry about ending. Isn't another worry that given that they are separate entities, whether they are a means entity or an end entity, such as, am I here just to serve another entity or am I here in my own right? So taking your analogy of the party goer who takes a drug to forget, at the point just before the party ends and before you might fall asleep, you might think that you might end, or you might consider yourself a different being from the one that wakes up the next morning. But you might actually think that you're an end in yourself because you don't serve even the means, in addition to yourself being an end, the means of producing a memory for a future being. Well, what do you think of means ends talk?
So the key thing to know, which is true of our society and many past societies, is from the outside, you can analyze the society and you can figure out what needs to happen for the society to function. Like some people need to take out the trash, and other people need to be warriors, and other people need, to raise children, et cetera. There's just things the society needs to do. And then any one person, you can predict a lot of people are doing those things because the society exists and is functioning. Now, what any one person doing those things, they don't have to have in their head consciously, I'm doing this because society needs it. That often is not very motivating. And there are many ways in which if you thought about what you're doing, you think, well, I'm just this cog in the big wheel, and I'm just doing what I have because some boss told me to, or capitalists are making me and they're rich. And there's lots of ways to frame your role in the world as an unwelcome role that you don't like, to be mad or depressed about it because You know, why am I this guy? And why am I doing this? The basic fact of a world is worlds continue to exist because people are flexible enough to find ways of looking at things so that they're okay with it. That's the basic thing to know about people. They're flexible. They find different ways of thinking about it. Most of them tend to find a way to get up in the morning for work, right? Alarm goes off, and why are they getting up for work? You could frame it as, I don't want to work today, but there they are, they're doing it. Why do they do it? They can just do it for 1,000 different reasons. Humans make up all sorts of rationalizations for lots of things, and they're not very consistent about it, and they're not that picky about it. So mostly it's possible to give people motivations to do the things they need to do, and they find ways and things get done. And this is human history. People in history have done lots more boring roles and jobs than you guys have, and they did them and got up every morning and did them. So M's can, you know, do their things because these are actually more interesting jobs. Are we about out of time? Are we going to end at 6:30? Was that the idea? And it's now 6:30, so I'm going to say thank you for coming, and I'll hang around a bit. I've got 3 more copies for sale if anybody wants to buy a copy of the book signed for $20. And good night, thank you very much.